Mark and Lily Thompson looked like the perfect couple, young, successful, and expecting their first child. But behind their white picket fence hid a secret so dark, it would shatter everything. When love turned to betrayal and betrayal to murder, Mark made one fatal mistake. He thought he was smart enough to get away with killing his pregnant wife. From the outside, Mark and Lily Thompson's life looked like something out of a dream. They lived in a quiet, well-kept neighborhood where mailboxes were freshly painted, children played in driveways, and everyone knew each other by name. Their two-story house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, surrounded by blooming gardens that Lily cared for with love. She was the kind of woman people described as gentle and sincere, always smiling, always helping others. Mark, on the other hand, was charming and ambitious, the kind of man who made a strong first impression. To their friends, they were the perfect couple, successful, happy, and about to become parents. Lily was 7 months pregnant, and she glowed with excitement every time she mentioned the baby. But beneath that picture-perfect surface, something darker was brewing. Mark had been living a double life. His co-workers had noticed changes in him. The late nights at the office, the distracted stares, the new cologne. It wasn't long before whispers started circulating about a woman named Rachel, a younger colleague who had joined the firm a few months earlier. What began as casual lunches and friendly banter turned into something more dangerous, something Mark convinced himself he could control. At first, he told himself it was harmless, a distraction from the pressure of impending fatherhood and financial responsibilities. But soon the thrill of secrecy became an addiction. Lily had no reason to suspect anything. She was busy preparing for the baby, spending hours decorating the nursery in soft pastel colors. She kept a journal by her bedside, writing letters to the unborn child about how loved they already were. When Mark came home late, she made excuses for him. He's just working hard, she'd tell herself, smiling weakly in the mirror as she rubbed her growing belly. She believed that love could fix anything, even distance. Mark, however, had grown cold. Every time he looked at Lily, he saw the life he no longer wanted. The baby, the responsibility, the routine. It all felt like a cage closing in around him. Rachel, with her carefree attitude and bold personality, offered him the escape he thought he needed. She made him feel young and wanted, not tied down. But Rachel was not content with being the secret. She began pushing him, asking questions about his marriage, demanding promises about the future. Mark's lies became more tangled by the day, and his carefully balanced world started to tilt. One evening, Lily planned a small dinner to celebrate the baby's upcoming arrival. She invited close friends and spent the whole day cooking, setting the table and arranging flowers. Mark arrived late, his shirt wrinkled and his expression distant. He smiled and played the role of the loving husband, but inside, he felt nothing but frustration. Every laugh, every toast, every moment of joy around that table made him feel trapped. When the guests finally left, Lily hugged him and said softly, "I can't wait for us to be parents." Mark's chest tightened, not with affection, but with panic. The next few days were filled with silence. Lily sensed something was wrong but didn't know how to reach him. She found herself crying alone at night, wondering if she had done something to drive him away. Meanwhile, Mark was spiraling. Rachel had threatened to end things unless he made a decision. He couldn't imagine life without her, but he also couldn't afford a divorce. His finances were stretched thin, and his reputation in the community meant everything. A scandal would ruin him. The idea started as a fleeting thought, a cruel whisper he quickly dismissed. But once planted, it grew roots. What if there was a way to be free without losing everything? What if tragedy could solve his problems? Mark hated himself for even thinking it. But the thought lingered. Each night as Lily slept beside him, he stared into the darkness, his mind turning over possibilities. He imagined a life without her, without the weight of fatherhood, without the lies. Outside, the world saw a happy couple awaiting their child. Inside, the walls of their home were closing in. Lily dreamed of a future filled with laughter and lullabies, while Mark dreamed of escape. And somewhere deep inside him, the idea of murder began to take shape, quiet, deliberate, and terrifyingly real. By the time Lily reached her 7th month of pregnancy, the tension inside the Thompson household had become unbearable. Mark barely spoke to her anymore, and when he did, his words were short and cold. He spent most evenings out of the house, claiming he had extra work or meetings to attend. Lily tried to believe him, but deep down she knew something had changed. The man who once kissed her goodnight now avoided her touch. The home that once echoed with laughter was now filled with heavy silence. Even the nursery, once her favorite room, had become a painful reminder of how distant he'd grown. One afternoon, while doing laundry, Lily found a receipt for an expensive dinner for 2. The name of the restaurant was one she knew well, a place where she and Mark used to celebrate anniversaries. Her heart sank. She didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was right there in her trembling hands. That night she waited for him to come home. When he finally walked through the door, smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers, she looked at him with tear-filled eyes. He avoided her gaze, muttered an excuse about being tired, and disappeared into the bedroom. She never confronted him again after that. She didn't have the strength. Mark, meanwhile, was consumed by guilt and anger in equal measure. Every time he saw Lily's swollen belly, he felt trapped, a reminder of the life he had chosen but no longer wanted. Rachel had started to pressure him more frequently, asking when he would leave his wife. She was tired of being a secret, tired of sneaking around. Mark's lies were unraveling, and he knew it. He promised her that things would be different soon, that he had a plan. But he didn't tell her what that plan really was. At night, when the house was quiet and Lily was asleep, Mark sat alone in the living room with a glass of whiskey, staring at nothing. The thought that had once horrified him was now becoming a solution. He convinced himself it was the only way out, that it was better for everyone if Lily wasn't in the picture. He told himself it would look like an accident. He told himself no one would ever know. The more he thought about it, the more confident he became. Days before the crime, Mark began preparing. He studied every corner of the house, thinking about how he could stage the scene. He rehearsed in his mind over and over until it felt almost natural. He even made small, calculated gestures to make sure no one suspected anything. He brought flowers home for Lily, cooked her dinner, and tried to act normal. She took it as a sign of reconciliation, believing maybe her husband was finally coming back to her. She smiled again, unaware that her trust was the very thing he planned to use against her. On a Thursday evening, the weather turned stormy. The wind howled outside and rain beat against the windows. Lily spent the day resting on the couch, her back aching from carrying the baby. Mark came home unusually early, his expression calm, almost peaceful. He made dinner and poured her a cup of tea, saying she should relax. She thanked him softly, her heart warming at the thought that maybe things were getting better. She had no idea it was her last meal. Later that night, when the house was quiet and Lily had drifted into sleep, Mark stood over her, frozen. His hand shook, but his mind was made up. He had rehearsed this moment for days, and now there was no turning back. The sound of thunder filled the silence as he carried out the unthinkable. It was over in minutes. When it was done, he stood there, breathing heavily, staring at what he had done. The weight of it pressed down on him, but he forced himself to focus. He cleaned carefully, removing anything that could raise suspicion. He dragged her to the stairs and arranged her body as if she had fallen. Then he called 911, his voice trembling, perfectly mimicking shock and despair. "My wife, she fell. Please help." The operator's calm instructions filled the air, but his words were pure performance. When the police arrived, they found a grieving husband and a tragic scene that looked like a household accident. Mark's plan had worked. For now. The news of Lily Thompson's death spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Neighbors who had seen her just days before, smiling and talking about baby names, stood in disbelief as police cars filled the quiet street. To everyone, it looked like a terrible accident. The stairs were steep, the floor was slippery from the rain, and a pregnant woman's balance could easily falter. Mark's performance was flawless. His eyes were red, his voice shaky, and his grief appeared genuine. He told everyone how he found her, how he tried to save her, how he couldn't believe she was gone. Friends hugged him, bringing casseroles and flowers, saying how sorry they were. No one questioned his story. Detective Sarah Collins arrived at the scene the following morning. She had worked on dozens of accidental deaths, but something about this one felt off. Maybe it was the husband's overly detailed story, or the way everything in the house looked too perfect, as if it had been arranged. While the other officers closed their notebooks, Sarah lingered. She noticed that the banister, supposedly the cause of Lily's fall, had no signs of damage or struggle. The floor was spotless, unusually clean for a home where an accident had just happened. She made a note in her file but said nothing. The autopsy confirmed that Lily had died from head trauma, but there were details that didn't fit. There were faint bruises on her neck and upper arms, as though someone had gripped her tightly before she fell. They were subtle, easy to miss, but Sarah couldn't ignore them. She visited Mark a few days later, pretending it was a routine follow-up. He welcomed her in with tired eyes and a weary smile, still playing the role of the devastated husband. He spoke softly, answering her questions with careful precision. His version of events was consistent, almost too consistent, as if he had memorized every word. After the visit, Sarah began looking deeper into his background. She learned that Mark had recently taken out a large life insurance policy on Lily, one that would pay out a substantial amount if she died accidentally. That discovery alone raised red flags. She also found records of late-night phone calls to a woman named Rachel, made in the weeks leading up to the death. When she called Rachel in for questioning, the woman was hesitant, nervous, and avoided eye contact. She admitted to knowing Mark from work but denied any romantic involvement. Sarah didn't believe her, but she had no proof yet. Meanwhile, Mark played his part perfectly. He attended the funeral dressed in black, standing beside Lily's coffin with tears streaming down his face. His speech was emotional, talking about how she was his everything and how he would raise their unborn child's memory in his heart forever. The crowd wept with him, moved by his sincerity. Even Detective Collins felt a flicker of doubt, wondering if maybe she had been wrong. But something in her gut kept whispering that there was more to the story. Weeks passed and the case was officially ruled an accident. The police closed the file and life in the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Mark returned to work, collected the insurance money, and resumed his affair with Rachel. To everyone around him, he was a man learning to live with grief. But to Sarah, the case never sat right. Late at night, she would reopen the folder, looking at the photos again. The bruises, the clean floor, the perfect story. She couldn't prove it yet, but she knew the truth was buried somewhere beneath the surface. Mark believed he was safe. He had fooled everyone, the neighbors, the police, even Lily's family. He spent the money, went on trips with Rachel, and started to enjoy his newfound freedom. But he didn't realize that the cracks in his story were still there, waiting to split open. Detective Collins wasn't done with him. She had a habit of following her instincts, and this time her instincts were right. Mark Thompson had gotten away with murder, but not for long. Months passed, and Mark Thompson's life seemed to return to normal. To outsiders, he was the picture of strength, a man slowly healing from unbearable loss. He went back to work, kept his house spotless, and even started volunteering at the local community center in Lily's memory. People admired him for his composure, calling him a good man who had endured tragedy with grace. But behind closed doors, Mark's composure was cracking. The guilt he thought he could bury began to haunt him in small, unexpected ways. He would wake up drenched in sweat, hearing phantom cries in the night, imagining Lily's voice calling his name. He avoided the nursery, keeping the door closed, pretending it didn't exist. And yet, despite the growing shadows in his mind, he still met Rachel in secret, convinced the worst was behind him. Detective Sarah Collins, however, couldn't let the case rest. Something about it still gnawed at her. She began quietly revisiting old evidence, going through every report, photo, and autopsy note. She noticed inconsistencies that others had ignored. A faint handprint on Lily's wrist that didn't match the way she supposedly fell, and the unusual cleaning residue found on the stairs. These small details formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Sarah decided to reopen the case unofficially, knowing she needed more proof before she could act. She began by re-interviewing witnesses. Neighbors mentioned hearing raised voices a few nights before Lily's death, though they hadn't thought much of it at the time. Others recalled seeing Mark's car leave the driveway late at night, something that didn't fit with his original statement. Piece by piece, Sarah began to reconstruct the truth. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that Lily hadn't fallen. She had been pushed. Her next step was Rachel. When Sarah showed up at her workplace unannounced, Rachel froze. She had moved on quickly after Lily's death, confident that the secret was buried. But under the detective's calm questions, her composure wavered. She admitted that she and Mark had continued seeing each other after Lily's death, though she claimed it was love, not conspiracy. When pressed further, she let slip that Mark had called her the night Lily died, his voice trembling, saying, "It's done." That single phrase lodged itself in Sarah's mind like a hook. Using that lead, Sarah subpoenaed phone records. They confirmed that Mark had made a call to Rachel just hours before dialing 911. He had told police that he was asleep at home the entire night. Yet evidence showed his car had been caught on a traffic camera a few blocks from a pharmacy that never recorded any purchases from him. It was the first solid proof that his timeline was false. With a warrant in hand, investigators searched Mark's home again. This time, they were thorough. In the basement, behind a loose wooden panel, they discovered a towel stained with a mix of blood and cleaning chemicals. It had clearly been used to wipe something down, something Mark thought he had hidden forever. DNA tests confirmed the blood belonged to Lily. When Sarah confronted him with the evidence, Mark tried to stay calm, insisting it was an old stain, maybe from one of Lily's nosebleeds during pregnancy. But his voice trembled, and sweat gathered on his forehead. The confident man who once fooled everyone was starting to unravel. Within days, the case was officially reopened as a homicide. News spread quickly, shocking the community that had once pitied Mark. Friends who had defended him now turned away. Rachel stopped answering his calls, terrified of being implicated. Detectives quietly watched his every move, waiting for him to slip. Mark began to panic. He realized the perfect story he had built was falling apart. Every lie, every act of deception was now being dissected by investigators. He barely slept, barely ate, and could no longer maintain his charming facade. The image of the grieving husband had shattered, revealing the truth beneath, a man who killed to escape, and now found himself trapped by the very lies he created. 2 years after Lily Thompson's death, justice finally began to close in. The evidence that Detective Sarah Collins had spent months gathering was enough to build a case that could no longer be ignored. The bloodstained towel, the altered timeline, the phone call to Rachel, it all pointed to one horrifying truth. What had once been seen as a tragic household accident was now being re-examined as a cold-blooded murder. When the news broke that Mark Thompson was being brought in for questioning, the quiet suburban neighborhood that once pitied him fell silent. People whispered behind curtains, shocked that the man they had once called a loving husband might have been a killer all along. At the police station, Mark tried to hold on to his calm demeanor. He sat across from Sarah, his face pale but composed. He still believed he could talk his way out of it. He had done it before, after all. But this time, Sarah had everything lined up: photos, reports, phone logs, witness statements, and forensic proof. She laid them out on the table one by one, each piece tightening the net around him. When she showed him the DNA report on the towel, he blinked, looked down, and didn't speak for a long time. His hands trembled slightly, but his pride wouldn't let him confess. He simply said, "You've got it wrong." Yet even as the words left his mouth, he knew no one believed him anymore. The case went to trial the following spring. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters, neighbors, and curious onlookers. Lily's family sat in the front row, clutching one another's hands, waiting for the truth to finally be spoken aloud. The prosecution painted a chilling picture. A husband living a double life driven by greed and lust, who saw his pregnant wife not as a partner, but as an obstacle. They revealed how Mark had carefully planned the murder, how he had staged the fall, and how he had almost convinced everyone it was an accident. The life insurance policy, the secret affair, the hidden evidence, all of it became part of the narrative that stripped away his mask of innocence. Rachel took the stand, her voice shaking as she recounted the night Mark called her, saying, "It's done." She explained that she hadn't understood the meaning at the time, but when she learned of Lily's death hours later, she realized what he meant. Her testimony shattered what little credibility Mark had left. When his defense tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, the prosecution countered with the forensic proof and phone records that showed a web of lies too complex to be coincidence. Throughout the trial, Mark sat motionless, his expression unreadable. Sometimes he stared at the floor. Other times he glanced toward Lily's family, but they never looked back. The jury deliberated for only a few hours before returning with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mark's shoulders slumped, and for the first time he looked small, fragile, and utterly defeated. The man who once thought he was smarter than everyone else now faced the reality of his choices. As he was led out in handcuffs, he didn't cry or plead. He just walked slowly, head down, as flashes from reporters' cameras lit the room. Outside, the sky was gray and light rain began to fall, a haunting echo of the night Lily died. For the first time in 2 years, Detective Sarah Collins allowed herself to breathe. She had promised Lily's family she wouldn't stop until they had justice, and now she had kept that promise. The house on the cul-de-sac was eventually sold. The new owners repainted the walls and redid the floors, but the neighbors said the air around it still felt heavy, as if it remembered what had happened there. Mark's name faded from the news after a while, buried under newer stories. But those who knew the truth never forgot. Behind the image of a perfect husband and father had lived a man capable of monstrous deceit. He had almost gotten away with it, but in the end, it was his arrogance, the belief that he could outsmart everyone, that led to his downfall. Lily's grave became a quiet place of reflection for those who visited, marked with flowers that never seemed to wilt. Her story was a reminder of how darkness can hide behind the brightest smiles, and how sometimes even the most carefully constructed lies can't withstand the weight of truth.